January 1907, northern Minnesota, 40 degrees below zero. Most of the mining operations across the Mesabi Range had slowed to a crawl. Sensible men did not work iron ore pits in that kind of cold. The metal tools became dangerous to touch with bare hands. The ground was frozen so deep and so hard that even the explosives behaved differently. Experienced miners knew when to wait for better conditions, but Rockefeller's mines did not wait. They ran around the clock through that frozen January because they had quotas to meet and steel mills to feed and a monopoly to maintain. And so on an ordinary freezing night in the northern section of the Hull-Rust Pit, a crew working the rock face broke through to something that was not supposed to be there. Not iron ore, not copper, not any geological formation that any of those men had ever encountered in years of underground work. Within hours, the foreman had shut everything down. Within 48 hours, the entire excavation site was cordoned off by company security. Armed Pinkerton guards, the private enforcement army of industrial America's most powerful families, were stationed at every entrance point. Whatever had been found was crated, loaded onto private rail cars, and moved east under cover of darkness on a priority routing that cleared every switch and yielded every track between northern Minnesota and New York. The official mining reports from that month do not exist. The workers who were present are gone from the employment records within the year, transferred to distant Rockefeller operations in Montana and Wyoming and Colorado, or simply erased from the payroll entirely with no forwarding information and no explanation. For 117 years, this story has been buried under layers of industrial history, filed as routine operations, dismissed before the question could fully form. But some things cannot be completely erased. A diary entry, a survey note, a family story carried through 3 generations by a Norwegian immigrant who spent the rest of his life saying nothing in public about the strangest thing he ever saw underground. This is what those fragments tell us. To understand what they found, you first need to understand what the Mesabi Range actually was, and why it mattered so completely to the men who controlled it. By 1907, this stretch of northeastern Minnesota had become the single most important piece of industrial real estate in the United States. The Rockefeller Mining Consortium controlled over 75% of the region's iron ore extraction, not through gradual organic growth, but through the same aggressive vertical integration strategy that had already transformed Standard Oil into the most dominant corporation in American history. These were not modest operations. Industrial-scale excavations moving millions of tons of earth every single year. Thousands of immigrant laborers, Norwegian, Finnish, Croatian, Slovenian, Italian, working in conditions that would be illegal today for wages that kept them dependent and manageable. A supply chain feeding directly into the steel mills that were building American cities and American railroads and American military capacity at a pace the world had never witnessed before. The Mesabi deposits were unusual from the very beginning. Unlike most iron ore formations that required deep, dangerous shaft mining, the Mesabi ore sat close to the surface in massive horizontal beds that were extraordinarily accessible by the standards of the era. This made the operation enormously profitable. It also meant something that the standard industrial history of the region tends to glide past without comment. It meant that miners were constantly breaking through to unexpected geological layers. The Mesabi Range sits on top of some of the oldest rock formations on the North American continent. Bedrock dating back over 2 billion years, part of the ancient Canadian Shield underlying much of the upper Midwest. But the actual technical geological surveys, not the simplified public versions distributed for general consumption, but the detailed field reports filed by working geologists, show layers within that ancient sequence that do not match the expected stratigraphic order, layers appearing far younger than the rock surrounding them. Geometric formations too consistent and too precise to be attributed to random natural processes. Patterns repeating across multiple excavation sites in ways that mainstream geology explains as glacial disruption or tectonic complexity, but which look, when examined carefully, considerably more like intentional engineering. It is against this geological backdrop, ancient rock with inexplicable anomalies, massive industrial excavations constantly breaking into unexpected strata, and a family controlling the entire operation with the practiced information management of people who had been controlling inconvenient information for decades, that the events of January 1907 need to be understood. The crew that broke through the northern rock face of the Hull-Rust Pit that January night was led by a foreman whose name has not survived in the accessible record, but one of the workers present was a Norwegian immigrant named Lars Nordstrom. He never spoke publicly about what he saw, but decades later he told his grandson, and his grandson remembered what Nordstrom described was not a cave. He was emphatic about that distinction in the way that only an experienced underground worker can be emphatic about it, because he had spent enough years in rock to know exactly what a natural void looked like and exactly what this was not. Caves form through erosion, through water cutting through soft limestone or sandstone over centuries and millennia. The surfaces are organic and irregular, shaped by the patient indifference of geological time. They have no straight lines, no consistent angles. No sense of deliberate proportion. What the crew was standing in front of had walls that were too smooth, too vertical, with angles that were too geometrically consistent to be anything other than the product of deliberate shaping. The space measured roughly 40 feet across and extended back into the rock face at least 30 feet before their lamps could not reach further. The temperature was wrong. They were hundreds of feet below the surface of a Minnesota January. The surrounding rock should have been cold enough to make metal tools painful to handle with bare hands, but inside the chamber the air was noticeably warmer, still and dry and insulated in a way that simple rock mass could not account for. The floor was smooth, not rough broken stone from a collapse or a water carving, smooth in the way that a surface becomes smooth when it has been worked and worn by use over a very long period of time. Along the walls, carved into the stone in patterns that repeated at regular intervals, were markings. Lars Nordstrom had worked in mining camps across northern Europe and the American Midwest. He had seen Scandinavian runes, Cyrillic letters, Germanic script. What he saw on those walls matched none of them. It matched nothing he had encountered anywhere. Two other members of the crew reported seeing metal fixtures embedded directly in the stone walls. Not ore veins, not natural mineral deposits catching the lamplight. Objects, manufactured objects that had been set into the rock deliberately by hands that knew what they were doing. They were not given time to examine them further. The foreman shut everything down before anyone could take a proper look at what they had found. And by that evening, the men in suits had arrived from Duluth, and the Pinkertons were already taking their positions at every entrance to the site. The events of the weeks immediately following the discovery are where the physical evidence becomes traceable, because some of it escaped the information control that was being rapidly and professionally assembled around the site. Thomas Milliken was a railroad clerk working the switching yards in Hibbing, a few miles from the Hull-Rust Pit. He was not a political man. He was not someone with an agenda. He was a working man who kept a personal diary as a simple daily habit, recording the ordinary details of ordinary days. His entry for February 8, 1907, is not ordinary. Milliken wrote that he had observed 6 sealed, enclosed freight cars moving through the switching yards after dark under armed guard. Not standard ore cars, the open-top cars that moved iron ore through those yards every day of the year. Enclosed freight cars of the kind used for transporting machinery or highly sensitive cargo, and significantly larger than typical rolling stock. The cars bore no company markings, no destination placards. Just a series of numerical codes that Milliken had never encountered in the railroad system in his years of working it, but the routing told the story that the blank cars would not. The cars were moving on a priority routing. In 1907 railroad operations, a priority routing was rare and expensive and required authorization from the very highest levels of management. It meant every other train on the line yielded. Every switch was preset ahead of the convoy. The cars moved on an express schedule with crew changes only, no stops, no inspections, no delays for any reason. The kind of routing reserved for cargo whose value or sensitivity made every additional hour of transit time unacceptable. The guards accompanying the cars wore no uniforms Milliken recognized. They refused all conversation with yard workers. They stood at every car with the practiced stillness of men accustomed to long silent watches over things they had been paid very well not to discuss. The destination was almost certainly Picantico Hills, the Rockefeller family estate in Westchester County, New York. Most people know Picantico Hills as a family home. a grand one, over 3,000 acres of private grounds, but it was considerably more than a residence. It contained warehouses, laboratories, and secure storage facilities that never appeared on any public map. Buildings whose purpose was known only to the innermost circle of Rockefeller associates and the carefully vetted researchers who signed confidentiality agreements before being permitted inside. The Rockefellers had been quietly collecting unusual objects for years. Archaeological expeditions to South America, Egypt, and the American Southwest throughout the 1890s and early 1900s. Expeditions that returned with crates of materials that never appeared in any museum catalogue. Financial records showing substantial payments to expedition leaders whose published findings never accounted for everything that came back with them. Whatever came out of the Hull-Rust Pit in those 6 sealed cars in February 1907 would have been entirely at home in those locked rooms at Pinkerton Hills. The most unsettling aspect of the 1907 Mesabi discovery is not what was found in that chamber. It is the mounting evidence that the Rockefellers already knew it was there before a single shovel of that specific section of ground was turned. In 1902, 5 years before the discovery, a survey team working for the United States Geological Survey conducted a subsurface assessment of the northern Mesabi Range. Their report, which exists in archived form, noted anomalous metallic structures beneath the surface layers of that specific section. The report described these structures explicitly as inconsistent with natural ore formation and recommended immediate further investigation. That follow-up investigation never happened publicly. By 1905, 3 years after the USGS flagged the anomaly, Rockefeller interests had purchased the mining rights to that exact section of ground, not the surrounding areas first and this section incidentally. That specific area, the one the government surveyors had identified as requiring closer examination. 2 years after that, in January 1907, the mining operation in that section broke through to the chamber. USGS identifies anomaly in 1902. Rockefeller acquires those specific mining rights in 1905. Chamber discovered in 1907. That sequence is not ambiguous. That sequence describes prior knowledge being converted into controlled access, being converted into private acquisition of whatever was inside. And then there is the private correspondence. In March 1907, weeks after the sealed cars left Hibbing, Rockefeller wrote to a business associate about securing what he described as the foundational elements of a forgotten industrial capacity. He was not talking about iron ore. He controlled the entire iron ore supply of the United States. That problem had been solved a decade earlier and required no correspondence. Forgotten industrial capacity. That phrase does not describe a raw material. It does not describe a geological formation or a mining technique or a business arrangement. It describes a technology, a system, something that existed before, that functioned before, and had been lost, and had now been found again. In 1908, the year immediately following the Mesabi discovery, John D. Rockefeller funded the construction of a new private research facility in upstate New York. The official designation was Metallurgical Testing Laboratory. The stated purpose was straightforward industrial science, testing metal alloys, evaluating ore compositions, supporting the steel operations that were the core of the Rockefeller industrial empire. Except it had no operational connection to any of those operations. No personnel transfers from existing steel or mining facilities, no integration with the supply chain, no published research output of any kind, no patents filed, no technical papers produced, no conference presentations, no peer-reviewed findings, 15 years of operation and nothing to show for it in the public scientific record. The building itself was constructed to specifications that made no sense for a testing laboratory. Reinforced concrete walls 3 feet thick, triple-locked vault systems, climate-controlled interior rooms whose temperature and humidity regulation would have been extraordinarily expensive to maintain with 1908 technology. A security protocol described by former employees as more consistent with a high-security museum than an active research environment. Those same former employees described the interior as containing large controlled rooms housing objects under study, not equipment in active use. Objects that no one would specifically describe. Objects that workers were apparently given very clear instructions not to discuss outside the facility under any circumstances. The facility operated from 1908 until it was quietly decommissioned in 1923. 15 years of total operational secrecy with no public output of any kind. Whatever was housed inside was removed before the decommissioning, relocated to another secure location that has never been publicly identified. The building still stands today, empty for over a century, the thick walls still present, the vault systems still in place. Whatever they were built to contain long since moved to somewhere that remains unknown. The timeline that connects these events is not subtle. January 1907, chamber found at Hull-Rust Pit. February 1907, 6 sealed cars leave Hibbing under armed guard on priority routing. March 1907, Rockefeller writes privately about securing the foundational elements of a forgotten industrial capacity. 1908, a heavily secured private research facility with no industrial purpose and no published output is constructed in upstate New York. Each step follows the previous one with the logical precision of a plan being executed rather than a series of coincidental events unfolding by chance. Every systematic cover-up has a human cost, and the Mesabi cover-up is no exception. After January 1907, the employment records for the Rockefeller-Mesabi operations show a pattern of departures that is striking in both its scale and its deliberate character. Between February and May of 1907, the 4 months immediately following the discovery, over 40 miners left the Hull-Rust operations, not scattered across the year in the normal rhythms of industrial turnover, concentrated in a tight 4-month window directly after the chamber was found and sealed. Some were transferred to other Rockefeller operations, not nearby operations in Minnesota or Wisconsin, where connections and community would have been easy to maintain. Distant operations in Montana and Wyoming and Colorado, places where a man from Hibbing, Minnesota, would have no existing network, no familiar faces, no easy way to stay connected to the people he had worked alongside underground in January. Others vanished from the payroll entirely. No transfer records, no forwarding addresses, no documentation of any kind indicating where they went or what arrangements had been made for their futures. Mining jobs in 1907 were stable and relatively well-paying in communities where stable employment was genuinely difficult to find. Men did not simply walk away from them without significant cause, either significant pressure from above or significant financial incentive from the same direction. The workers who resurfaced in other Rockefeller operations years later had something consistent in common beyond their employer. They were financially comfortable. They had been placed in positions that kept them well compensated. They did not congregate. They did not maintain visible correspondence with former Mesabi colleagues. They lived out their working lives in quiet, scattered stability that had the precise shape of a managed arrangement. And then in 1911, 4 years after the discovery, an independent surveyor named Howard Blackwell was working in northern Wisconsin just across the state line from the Hull-Rust Pit, mapping mineral deposits for a private contracting company. His field notes, which survive in a state historical archive, record encountering subsurface anomalies consistent with artificial construction near the Minnesota border. When he reported these findings to his contracting company, he was immediately reassigned. The area he had been surveying, he was told, was under private claim. The private claim belonged to a Rockefeller shell company. Howard Blackwell never worked in that region again. When you have removed the objects from a discovery site, the most complete way to eliminate the remaining physical evidence is to remove the site itself. If you look at the excavation history of the Hull-Rust Pit with this in mind, something becomes visible in the numbers that is otherwise easy to miss. After 1907, the mining activity in the specific northern quadrant of the pit, the section where the January discovery occurred, accelerated dramatically, not as part of a general expansion of operations across the entire mine. Specifically and disproportionately in that section, that particular area was mined deeper and faster than the surrounding sections year after year through the following 2 decades. By the 1920s, the entire quadrant had been excavated down to bedrock and beyond. No chamber, no smooth walls, no polished floor, no carved markings in an unrecognized script, no metal fixtures embedded in the stone, no physical trace of anything unusual having ever been present in that section of the pit. Just a massive open excavation and a silence that has now lasted 117 years. This fits a pattern that extends far beyond the Mesabi range. Across North America, there are dozens of documented cases from the industrial era of excavations uncovering structures that do not fit the accepted historical timeline. Foundations beneath established cities predating colonial settlement. Metalwork showing smelting techniques supposedly not yet developed. Architectural remnants suggesting a continent-wide infrastructure already in place before the 1800s. The official response to each case follows the same sequence. Natural formations, misidentified artifacts, enthusiastic misinterpretation by untrained observers. The consistent application of identical dismissals across dozens of independent discoveries in multiple states over multiple decades is itself a pattern that demands explanation. The Rockefellers were not simply oil barons and industrialists. They were systematic collectors of knowledge and systematic controllers of information on a scale that most people do not fully appreciate even now. Archaeological expeditions funded, conducted, and quietly absorbed into private collections. Manuscripts acquired and locked away. Research facilities constructed, operated, and decommissioned without a single line of published output. If they found something in the Mesabi range in January 1907 that constituted evidence of a prior civilization, a prior technology, a prior industrial capacity that predated everything the standard historical account is prepared to acknowledge, they had the resources, the institutional reach, and the established operational methodology to contain it completely. And the shape of what happened in the years that followed suggests that is precisely what they did. Today, you can visit the Hull-Rust Pit. They call it the Grand Canyon of the North. Tour buses run on regular schedules. There are observation decks with carefully written informational placards explaining the history of American steel production, the immigrant communities that built the mining industry, the environmental legacy of a century of resource extraction at industrial scale. It is genuinely impressive in the way that only true vastness is impressive. Nearly 4 miles long, 2 miles wide, over 500 feet deep in its lowest sections. The sheer volume of earth that human beings moved from that place over those decades is almost beyond the capacity of the mind to hold as a single number. You will not hear about January 1907. You will not hear about the chamber with the smooth walls and the polished floor and the markings carved in an unrecognized script that repeated at regular intervals along the stone. You will not hear about the temperature that should not have been warm. You will not hear about Lars Nordstrom standing in lamplight in that space, with the cold rock pressing in from every direction outside and the inexplicable stillness of the air inside. You will not hear about the Pinkertons, about Thomas Millikan watching 6 unmarked cars move through the switching yards after dark, about 40 miners quietly dispersed across the country to distant operations with comfortable arrangements and no forwarding addresses. You will not hear about the upstate New York facility with the 3-foot concrete walls and the triple-locked vaults and the climate-controlled rooms full of objects that no former employee would specifically describe. That story exists only in the fragments that survived the collection effort. A diary entry from a railroad clerk who had no reason to fabricate what he recorded. A USGS survey note recommending investigation of anomalous structures that were never publicly investigated. A private letter from the most powerful industrialist in American history referring to the foundational elements of a forgotten industrial capacity in the weeks after something was pulled from the frozen ground and shipped away under armed guard in the dark. A family story carried through 3 generations from a Norwegian immigrant who spent the rest of his life knowing what he had seen and saying nothing about it in public because he understood, with the practical clarity of a working man who had watched 40 of his colleagues quietly disappear from the payroll, exactly what saying something in public would cost him. And a massive open pit, where the section that matters most has been mined to bedrock and beyond. Every physical trace of whatever was once there processed into iron ore and scattered into the industrial history of a century that preferred not to ask certain questions. The evidence that remains is not the kind that can be weighed or measured or displayed in a laboratory. It is the shape left by what is missing. The outline formed by a USGS anomaly that was never followed up, mining rights purchased with suspicious specificity, a discovery that generated immediate armed response, sealed cars moving on priority routing, 40 workers dispersed with unusual precision, a research facility built for no stated purpose, an excavation history that looks like deliberate erasure, and a silence maintained with the consistency that only comes from people who understood very clearly what they were being silent about and why. Something was found in the Mesabi range in the winter of 1907. The question the observation deck placards will never answer, the question that 117 years of managed silence has been specifically constructed to prevent you from thinking to ask, is not whether something was there. The question is what it was, where it is now, and what it tells us about who was here before us, what they built, and what happened to everything they left behind. The pit is still there, still being mined, the earth still giving up what it contains one carefully controlled layer at a time, and somewhere in the gap between the industrial history on the placards and the fragments that slipped through before the window closed, the shape of something extraordinary persists. Quiet, patient, waiting.